What's up, you guys? I'm Dan, this is Frugal Not Cheap, and today we'll talk about expat finances. Some of you know that my plan is to take advantage of geographical arbitrage and retire early abroad. This will greatly reduce my spending, allowing me to have an earlier retirement than otherwise would be possible, or to have a much lower withdrawal rate at the beginning in order to build up a real big safety margin for the future. However, I did a little bit of looking around on YouTube. As I was doing some research on some of the different topics in here. Every now and then I just like to brush up and make sure I'm up to date on different parts of my strategy. And you'll see that oftentimes people talk about moving abroad as if it's just something that you just do. You just open up a brokerage account somewhere and then head off into the sunset. And the reality is it's really not that simple. There are a lot of considerations, especially after some legislation that was passed in recent decades. Now, specifically, today's video will be focused on being an American expat, so being a U.S. citizen living abroad, because the U.S. is one of the, actually there aren't that many countries that do this, where they will tax you on your worldwide income regardless of where you live. So for instance, I'm currently a Mexican national, but I've been living outside of Mexico since 1998, and I've never owed them any taxes. But if I were to repatriate and move back to Mexico, I would have to pay them taxes. But for the U.S., no matter where I go, Uncle Sam wants his take of anything that I make. Depending on your citizenship and where you plan to retire, then parts of this video will be less or more helpful depending on your situation. But I think we'll definitely touch on at least a few different points that should help you in your planning, or even if you're just a little bit curious about it, to get an idea of what's involved. So I think the first thing to consider is how you're going to stay in the country that you're planning to retire to or move to. Because, as American citizens, we have the privilege of being able to stay somewhere for, 30, 60 plus days without any kind of a visa. It's just like a visa on arrival. But beyond that period, though, you actually need to have some kind of a valid way to stay within that country and not flout its immigration laws. In my case, I'm looking at the country of Thailand, and they have what's called an education visa, where it's like 6 months extendable to a year. Every 3 months you have to do a little report. But basically, as long as you have a valid reason, you're studying there, you can stay there for up to that 1 year. Staying beyond that will require some other things. In my case, perhaps what's called an elite visa, where you pay anywhere between $16,000 to $20,000 to $25,000, depending on how long you want the visa to be valid for, and it allows you multiple entry in and out of the country. Now, I'm 38 years old, and the cool thing about Thailand is once you reach the age of 50, you're able to actually get a retirement visa. It has different requirements, but at that stage, things get a lot easier. So really, I just need to get between age, say, 40 and 50 if I were to retire at age 40. An elite visa for about $20,000 that will cover those 10 years would work well for me. And so, there are a lot of different schemes or ways that countries are trying to attract retirees, and they'd want to, because you're coming in there, you're unlikely to cause a lot of problems, and you're really just going to be adding an influx of spending into the economy, right? You're not really going to be taking anything out. So, it is attractive. Portugal had some attractive measures that they're starting to unwind. So lots of different countries. Yeah, as we go forward, I will dive deeper into many of these topics with their own specific videos. So for today, know that I'm just going to talk enough about each point to make the point, but the details, of course, will be left for further research and for further videos. All right, so now we've sorted out the visa stuff, so we're not going to be afoul of any immigration. Then, of course, the next thing that we need is a way to spend money while we're abroad, and of course to fund ourselves while we're out there as well. So this leads us to financial accounts. So why don't we begin with actually the local account. While in Thailand I might need to get a local bank account, it's possible that you might not need to, but some of these different visa schemes require that you put some financial assets and invest it into the local economy. So you're going to have a local account. In my case, I might have a local bank account in Thailand, and because of something called FBAR, basically I think that stands for Foreign Bank Account Reporting, but it's really reporting of any foreign bank and financial institutions. This is something that's been required for a long time. And you just report that you have this, these foreign assets to FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network of the US Treasury. So that's going to be one piece of paperwork that you have to do. And then, of course, assuming you earn some interest, then the institution that you work with, in my case, it might be Bangkok Bank or Kasikorn Bank, will also have to fill out a W-9, just whatever the paperwork is, to tell the IRS how much interest you've earned. And then, of course, you'll have to do that on your taxes later. Speaking of taxes, that's where we get to another wrinkle. That's something called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA, F-A-T-C-A, which sounds a little bit like Fat Cat because they're kind of going after, sort of globalist capitalists. But anyway, so this is another wrinkle, and it makes reporting for those of us that are expatriates a lot more onerous for financial institutions, even when they're US based, right? So we talked about, yeah, we're going to have this, maybe this local bank account, maybe we can get by with having just a different kind of a US-based checking account that will pay for ATM fees and different things like that, so like a Charles Schwab card. But then our brokerage accounts, all our investment accounts, they're going to have to do these FATCA requirements, which can be quite onerous. And so what that's meant, since this was implemented back in, I think, around 2014, that there are a lot less players out there that are going to be willing to do all those reporting requirements for you if you're living abroad and having a US domiciled account. Now, the larger your asset base is, like let's say you had $1 million plus at Merrill Lynch, they might be a little bit more likely to be friendly with you. But I know that, so for instance, Vanguard, one that's really beloved by FIRE people, they're not all that great about people that are abroad. They're a little bit difficult about that. Now, one thing you could do is try to keep sort of all your addresses and all that stuff in the States. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. But for now, I've kind of looked at the list of the companies that are out there. And as you know, my favorite brokerages are sort of the holy trinity or triumvirate of Fidelity, Vanguard, and Charles Schwab, because they're sort of the low-cost brokerages that I think are quite good. Out of those, Fidelity is not very expat friendly. You can trade ETFs, but liquidation only once they know that you're living abroad, so no good. Vanguard's a similar situation. But Charles Schwab has a whole expat suite. They have Schwab International, which is really set up for this kind of thing. So that's probably going to be where I'm going to go. I already have a lot of assets with them anyway, so it'll just be a matter of moving over there. Okay, so that's set up. That's going to be, where the financial accounts are, maybe a checking account, and then we also have maybe a local bank account. Now, the thing with these US investment accounts, because I don't really want to invest, move all of my investments over to another country, that's giant pain and also risky. A lot of other places don't have the same kind of investor protections that the United States has. Then we have this address problem. So where am I going to get my credit and debit cards? How am I going to have a physical address in the US so that these companies don't freak out? Again, generally the easiest thing to do is to use friends or family's address. But you have to be very careful in selecting this address because the state that you choose may have some tax consequences. So picking a family member that lives in California, for instance, could be a really, really bad choice in case the state of California were to come after you at some point for their income taxes, and they're very aggressive about doing that. Whereas, if you have family in Florida or if you have family here in the state of Texas, then that's going to work out a lot better. So my plan is I have a couple of friends that are likely to really set down roots here in the state of Texas, so I'll probably use their address as my sort of physical address. But in order to not inundate them with mail, you don't want to annoy people with that, then actually I will set up a mail forwarding service. There are many of them that have been catering to RVers and expatriates for a long, long time. And I will use that for my mailing address. So there are many that will provide a local address here in Texas, actually some right here in Dallas. Now, why don't I use that address as my primary address? Well, that's because all of these institutions have sort of cottoned on to the fact that these are not real residential addresses. And so they are not valid as your primary address in many cases. Each institution's a little bit different about how stringent they will be. You could also get lucky, and I suspect that depending on how big your account is, they may be more or less likely to kind of dig into that for you. Yeah, your mileage is probably going to vary, but in my case, again, I will use one of these services. They will be able to, scan my mail, forward on things internationally. There's a fee, generally there's a certain amount of free stuff, and then there's fees for the extra stuff. But generally the cost is not terrible, and I will definitely do another video on this topic in the future. There are many services services out there, like traveling mailbox. And there's one for RVers, especially, that the name escapes me, but it's pretty memorable. I'll put it up on screen. So that'll take care of the mailing address and all that stuff, so we don't have any big trouble. But that's not the end of the troubles, because while we're abroad, we're trying to log into all of our financial accounts, obviously from abroad, and they're going to know that. And so that can also be a problem, because many sites, for security, they're thinking like, oh, this could be some, bad actor that's trying to steal your stuff. So we're going to make it difficult for them, and we're going to have them prove that they're you. And the way that they might do this is with two-factor authentication. So we're talking like a text message to a phone number, or in some cases just an email, which is nice. You'll probably still have access to that. But then you might have two-factor authentication for the account that has your email address. So still a really important consideration. So how are we going to do that? Well, one possible option is Google Voice. So you can have a totally internet-based phone number from Google. I actually have one, and have had one for a very, very long time. So that's one option. But just like with the address thing, your mileage is going to vary as to which financial institutions are going to be okay with a Google Voice number. Some institutions sort of like just don't, the text that they send out with the code never gets to your Google Voice number because it's not compatible with their systems. So then you're SOL, right? So this is not good. So what can you do instead? Well, what I'm going to do is I've already got Google Fi. It's a real phone number with Google, and it's really friendly for traveling. However, they really don't want you to travel permanently with this. In fact, their terms of service, not their terms of service, but sort of internally their policy is kind of like after 6 months, you should really be coming home. You're really not their target customer beyond that point. But last time that I saw them send someone a notice about that, they said that they would cut them off from cellular data, but they would still allow them to use calls and texts while they were abroad. So what I'm going to try to bank on, my hope, is that I'll be able to pay just the base $20 a month, turn cellular data off while I'm out there. I don't really use data all that much anyway. And then I'll be able to rely on Wi-Fi, which there's a lot of in Bangkok. And then, of course, Wi-Fi at home as well. And then I'll still be able to do calls and texts. So I'll still be reachable, and I'll still be able to get, most importantly, those two-factor authentication codes. So that's going to be good, especially because some people try to sort of spoof using a VPN to log into the institution so that the institution's not thinking that you're abroad. But actually, even then, they can tell you're using VPN. So that's actually started not to work as well. So you can see here, there's just a lot of complication with living abroad, and we have to find these workarounds, and none of it is exactly perfect. But at least for now, I have a plan, and hopefully that's kind of getting you started on thinking about how you might create a plan for yourself. All right, so the last thing I think that we'll talk about here, because we're getting pretty involved, and we'll want to break these down and dig deeper in individual topics in future videos, is probably going to be fees. So there are all kinds of fees that you might pay. And one is going to be just ATM fees. So that's why an account like the Schwab account that I'm probably going to have, they reimburse for ATM fees. That's really great. You also want to make sure that they don't charge really big exchange rate kind of things as well when we're changing currencies. That's another important consideration. So that's on the cash side. Then in terms of just getting the cash from one account to another, you might need to consider international wires. So then you want to compare services and see which ones have the best rates. But then also credit cards. So even abroad, I still want to try to take advantage as much as I can of credit card ecosystems here in the US where you can earn a ton of points. And so there we need to be careful about foreign transaction fees. And so a lot of the more premium cards don't have foreign transaction fees like the Amex Platinum or the Chase Sapphire Reserve, but these come with hefty annual fees that don't provide a good value for me based on my math while doing my fire budget in Bangkok. So which ones do work? Well, these are cards from Capital One, and they're actually really good about this. So the Capital One Quicksilver gives you 1.5% cash back, no foreign transaction fee. Capital One SavorOne, no transaction fee. Gives you 3% back on dining, entertainment, groceries, and streaming. So these are two great cards with no annual fee that also have no foreign transaction fees. So a good base right there. But then on top of that, because I do still plan on doing some travel, then I've got the Capital One Venture X, gives 2% back on everything, and then additional points on flights, hotels, and rental cars booked through the travel portal. 5% back on flights, 10% on rental cars and hotels, I think, something like that. So anyway, also a great card providing lounge access and all that stuff that, yeah, you can see more about the Venture X card in another one of my videos. All right, and then finally, the last topic to discuss is once you've kind of set up this whole system, you're living your life, everything's been great, all of a sudden it becomes January, February of the next year, and you realize, oh, I've got to do my taxes now. How are you going to do that? So again, the tax requirements are going to be a little bit more difficult, especially if you have a foreign account, because you've got to report that foreign income as well, and there are additional forms. How are you going to do that? There are different services out there. H&R Block just started a new DIY expatriate thing. That's one possible option. The platform that I'll probably use is TaxAct because I'm familiar with their software. It's really good. So probably what I'll do is the year before I file, I'll file my taxes with TaxAct, even though there will be a cost compared to Free Tax USA. I really like Free Tax USA, but yeah, then I'll just be set up so that everything's kind of already in there for the next year when I file, and then you know, they have support for all these additional forms for the foreign stuff, which is great, and the cost is not terrible. All right, so I think that runs the gamut, and I think you can very clearly see that it's not as simple as just open brokerage account, have lots of money in there, and then bail, you know, right off into the sunset. I wish it were that simple, but that's just not the case. It's going to take some planning and research, and this gave you an idea of my planning and research so far. More details to follow. Hope you found today's video helpful. If you did, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.